The fog clung to the island of Haven's End like a shroud, a perpetual damp breath from the sea that muffled the world beyond its jagged shores. It was the autumn of 1902, and this remote splinter of rock off the coast of Maine existed in a state of suspended animation, isolated not just by treacherous gray waters but by a choice made generations ago. The island itself seemed to exhale a sigh of weary antiquity, its stunted pines and wind-scoured cliffs standing as silent sentinels to a secret it had long since grown tired of keeping. From the mainland, it was a smudge on the horizon, a place of rumor and uneasy glances from fishermen who knew to give its waters a wide berth. Within that cocoon of mist, life followed a rhythm dictated not by the clocks of the modern world, but by the stern, unwavering voice of Patriarch Abner. Each dawn, the clan gathered in the central clearing, their figures spectral in the weak morning light. They were a collection of souls bound by more than just kinship. Their bloodlines were a tightly woven tapestry, its threads crossed and recrossed so many times the original pattern was lost. To Abner, this was not a failing but their greatest strength, the source of their divine favor. He moved among them, a tall, gaunt figure whose own features, a pronounced brow and deep-set eyes that burned with fervor, were a testament to generations of selective breeding. He preached to them of purity, his voice a low rumble that cut through the damp air. He spoke of the outside world as a place of filth and corruption, where diluted blood led to diluted souls. Here, on Haven's End, their closed circle was a sacred covenant. The physical marks that some of them bore, a child's slightly twisted hand, a young woman's mismatched eyes, a man's slow, deliberate gait, were not deformities to be hidden. They were, Abner declared with chilling conviction, stigmata. They were the tangible proof of God's closeness, a divine fingerprint upon their flesh, a sign that their blood was so pure it could not help but manifest the sacred in the physical realm. The clan listened, their faces a mosaic of quiet acceptance and fervent belief. Their daily rituals were acts of devotion to this twisted faith. Meals were taken in silence, each bite a sacrament. Work, mending nets, tending the sparse vegetable patches, was performed with a solemnity that bordered on prayer. They were waiting, always waiting, for the next sign, the next mark of God's favor upon their chosen line. And far out on the water, beyond the curtain of fog, a young fisherman named Elias mended his own nets, unaware that the currents of fate were already pulling him toward the island's secret shore. The wind that day carried not just the scent of salt and pine, but a whisper of the impending convergence, a foreshadowing that went unnoticed by all but the island itself. The isolation was complete, the faith absolute, and the stage was set for a collision of two worlds, one damned by its solitude, the other soon to be haunted by its discovery. The sea did not rage so much as it shattered, a churning chaos of black water and screaming wind that tore the night to pieces. Elias's world had shrunk to the bucking deck of his fishing vessel, the sea wife, and the frantic, futile struggle to keep her bow pointed into the waves. Salt stung his eyes, and the gale ripped the breath from his lungs. Each impact of water against the hull was a hammer blow, the groaning timbers a death rattle. He had faced squalls before, but this was a biblical fury, a force intent on scouring the coast clean. A monstrous wave, a wall of liquid darkness, rose up and blotted out the sky. It struck with the force of a cannonade, and the sea wife rolled, her mast snapping like a twig. The cold was an instant, brutal shock as the ocean claimed him, pulling him down into its roaring, lightless heart. Consciousness returned in agonizing fragments. The crushing pressure was gone, replaced by a brutal ache in his ribs and a throbbing in his skull. He was being dragged, his body scraping over coarse sand and sharp pebbles. Each gasp was a victory, the air thick with the spent fury of the storm. He lay half in, half out of the surf, vomiting salt water, his muscles trembling with a profound exhaustion. The world swam into focus slowly. He was on a beach, shrouded in a pre-dawn gloom, the receding waves hissing over dark, seaweed-strewn sand. Jagged cliffs loomed ahead, their tops lost in a low, clinging mist. This was not the familiar coast of Maine. This place felt ancient and deeply wrong. Footsteps, soft and careful, approached. Two figures emerged from the mist, their forms indistinct at first. A man and a woman, both clad in rough-spun, dark wool. They moved with a strange, deliberate slowness, their eyes wide and unblinking. The man, Caleb, was broad-shouldered with a heavy brow and a jaw that seemed slightly misaligned. The woman, Miriam, had a delicate face, but her eyes were set a fraction too far apart, giving her gaze an unsettling, bird-like quality. They did not speak as they knelt beside him, their hands probing his injuries with a clinical detachment that held no warmth. Their curiosity was palpable, a quiet, intense scrutiny that felt more invasive than the ocean's violence. Caleb grunted, hefting Elias's arm over his shoulder, while Miriam took the other side. They moved with a coordinated strength that belied their odd stillness, hauling him up from the unforgiving shore. As they carried him away from the sea, Elias's disoriented mind began to register the strangeness of his surroundings. The island was unnervingly silent. There was no chatter of birds, no rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. The only sounds were the distant sigh of the retreating storm and the soft crunch of their footsteps on the path. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic and old. The trees were stunted and twisted, their branches clawing at the gray sky. Through the fog, he could make out the shapes of simple, wooden huts clustered together, a village that seemed to huddle against the landscape as if for protection. No lights shone in the windows, no voices called out. It was a place of profound and eerie quiet, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath, as if the very island was waiting. The hut they brought him to was a stark, square space that smelled of damp wood and wood smoke. Its sparse interior offered no comfort, only a crude pallet of straw stuffed ticking in one corner and a single rough-hewn stool. A small, soot-blackened hearth held the ghost of a fire, its faint warmth doing little to chase the pervasive chill from the air. Caleb and Miriam deposited him onto the pallet with an impersonal efficiency, their movements economical and synchronized. Miriam soon returned with a wooden bowl of thin fish stew and a clay cup of water. The food was plain, sustenance without flavor, but Elias ate greedily, his body craving the warmth and energy. As he ate, he felt their eyes upon him, a collective, unblinking gaze from the small group that had gathered just outside the open doorway. They did not speak, only watched, their stillness more unnerving than any hostile gesture. It was in that heavy silence that Elias began to truly see them. His initial, storm-addled impressions sharpened into a disturbing clarity. The man who had carried him, Caleb, possessed a powerful build, but his right shoulder sat higher than his left, giving him a perpetual rolling gait. A young woman standing beside him had one ear noticeably larger and lower than the other. An older man's fingers were fused together into a single, paddle-like hand, which he used with a strange dexterity. There were slight limps, asymmetrical smiles, eyes of mismatched colors or set at subtly different levels. These were not the scars of hard labor or accident. They were inherent quirks of form, a gallery of minor physical divergences that, taken together, created a portrait of a people folded in upon themselves for generations. Their scrutiny was intense, a palpable pressure in the small room. He was an anomaly, a specimen of the outside world they so clearly despised, and they studied his unmarred symmetry with a mixture of suspicion and a deep, unsettling curiosity. The crowd outside parted silently as Patriarch Abner entered the hut. He filled the small space, his gaunt frame seeming to draw the meager light toward him. He did not sit, but stood over Elias, his deep-set eyes conducting a slow, thorough inventory. He asked his questions in a flat, toneless voice, each one a deliberate probe. He inquired about the cities on the mainland, their size, their noise. He asked about the people, their customs, their faith. With every answer Elias gave, a flicker of profound disdain crossed Abner's features. He spoke of the outside world not as a place, but as a sickness, a realm of impurity, where bloodlines were muddied and souls were diluted by choice and chance. To him, the bustling ports and thriving communities Elias described were testaments to a spiritual decay, a willful turning away from the sacred path of purity that his clan walked. Later, as the gray afternoon light began to fade, a young girl slipped into the hut. She was small, perhaps 10 years old, with wide, intelligent eyes and a quiet grace that set her apart from the others. She placed a fresh cup of water beside his palate, her movements quick and fluid. Her name, he learned, was Leah. Unlike the others, her gaze held no judgment, only a frank and startling curiosity. For a fleeting moment, her eyes met his, and in their clear depths, he saw none of the fervent zeal that burned in Abner's, nor the dull acceptance that clouded the others. Instead, he saw a spark of something else, a quick, perceptive intelligence, a flicker of a spirit that had not been entirely subdued by the island's oppressive doctrine. She was gone as quietly as she had come, but the brief, wordless connection lingered, a single point of light in the gathering gloom of Haven's End. The wind that swept through Haven's End carried more than the scent of salt and damp earth. It carried secrets, hushed and hurried, that slipped through the cracks between huts and coiled around the twisted pines. Elias, his body still aching from the storm, found himself an unwilling eavesdropper to a world speaking in codes. Restless and confined to his sparse hut, he began taking short, limping walks around the periphery of the settlement, and it was during these excursions that the true nature of the clan began to unravel before him. He heard them first near the communal well, two women drawing water, their heads bent close together. Their voices were low, but the words were sharp and distinct in the heavy air. "The pure blood shows in the young ones," one murmured, her voice reverent. "Another blessing has been marked upon Samuel's boy," the other nodded, a slow, solemn gesture. "The Lord draws close to those who keep the line clean." The signs cannot be denied. Elias froze, the words "pure blood" and "blessing" landing with a cold weight in his stomach. This was not the language of deformity as misfortune. It was the lexicon of divinity. Later that day, a small commotion drew his attention to the center of the clearing. A boy of no more than 5 was being gently guided forward by his mother. His left arm was twisted, the hand curled inward like a fledgling's claw, the limb noticeably shorter than the other. Elias braced himself for the pity he expected to see on the faces of the onlookers, the averted gazes of discomfort. Instead, he witnessed something that chilled him to his core. The clan members gathered around the child, their expressions not of sorrow, but of awe. They did not look away. They leaned in. Rough hands reached out to gently touch the boy's shoulder, his hair. Soft murmurs of praise be, and a true mark rippled through the crowd. The boy himself beamed, his face alight with a pride that was both beautiful and horrifying. He was not an object of pity. He was a celebrated icon, his twisted limb a sacred relic. A cold dread, sharp and certain, began to crystallize in Elias's gut. This was not simple isolationism. This was a faith that worshipped distortion. It was Miriam who found him later, as he stood staring out at the gray, choppy sea. The image of the celebrated boy burned into his mind. She moved silently to his side, her bird-like gaze fixed on the horizon. For a long moment, she said nothing, the only sound the mournful cry of the wind. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low it was almost swallowed by the elements. "Not everything that is celebrated is holy," she whispered, the words meant for him alone. Her eyes, when they briefly flicked toward his, held a deep, weary caution. "And not every secret is meant to be found. The currents around this island are treacherous, Elias. They can pull a man under before he even knows he's in deep water. Be careful where you wade." Her warning was a delicate, deliberate thing, a thread of sanity thrown to him in a rising tide of madness. She did not elaborate, turning and melting back into the mist-shrouded paths of the village as silently as she had come. But her words lingered, a clear and chilling confirmation that the dread coiling within him was justified. The whispers in the wind were not just talk. They were the outer edges of a deep, dark secret, and he was standing at its precipice. The summons came not with a shouted command, but with a silent, looming presence at his doorway. Caleb stood there, his asymmetrical frame blocking the gray light, and with a single, slow nod, conveyed that the patriarch required his presence. A cold knot tightened in Elias's stomach, a premonition that the veiled warnings and whispered secrets were about to be made terrifyingly explicit. He was led not to the central clearing, but to a different structure, set slightly apart from the others. A long, low building of weathered timber, its roof thick with moss. The air around it was still and heavy, smelling of old wood and cold ash. This was not a home. It was a place of purpose. Inside, the light was dim, filtering through a single, small window covered with a stretched hide. The room was devoid of any comfort, containing only a large, scarred wooden table and a few backless benches. Patriarch Abner stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on its surface, his deep-set eyes fixed on Elias as he entered. The door closed behind him, leaving the two of them in the hushed, sepulchral quiet. Abner did not gesture for him to sit. This was not to be a conversation, but a pronouncement. "You have seen our people," Abner began, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled the confined space. "You have witnessed the marks upon them. Your world would call them flaws, curses of a confined bloodline. Your world is blind," he paused, letting the weight of his judgment hang in the air. "What you see are not deformities, fishermen. They are divine sigils, each one a testament to our purity, a physical manifestation of our singular bond with God." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. He kept his face a careful, neutral mask, schooling his features into an expression of attentive curiosity, even as a wave of visceral horror threatened to break through. Abner's doctrine unfolded like a sacred text, its logic twisted and terrifying. He spoke of generations upon generations of carefully curated unions, of bloodlines kept pure and undiluted by the corrupting influence of the outside world. This sustained inbreeding, he explained, was not a descent into decay, but an ascent. It was a refining fire, burning away the dross of common humanity to reveal a purer, more sacred essence. The closer the blood ties, the stronger the connection to the divine became, until God's presence was so overwhelming it began to etch itself upon their very flesh and minds. "My great-grandfather, Hezekiah," Abner said, a note of reverence entering his toneless voice. He was a man of such profound purity that he saw the architecture of heaven in the patterns of frost on his window. He would speak in tongues unknown to any man, his words a direct conduit to the Almighty. He needed no food for weeks at a time. Sustained by the light of God's grace, he shared another story, of a woman 2 generations past who bore a child with 6 fingers on each hand. The clan had rejoiced, for the extra digits were seen as a sign of God's abundant blessing, a physical multiplication of his favor. The child, he claimed, had possessed an uncanny wisdom, able to predict the weather and sense the intentions of others with unnerving accuracy. Elias listened, his hands clenched into fists hidden at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. Each anecdote was a brick in a grotesque cathedral of faith, a celebration of madness and physical anomaly as divine enlightenment. He saw the fervent light in Abner's eyes and understood that the patriarch truly believed every word. This was not a cynical manipulation. It was the core truth of his existence, a truth that justified every twisted limb and addled mind on the island. Elias hid his revulsion behind a mask of thoughtful silence, nodding slowly as if processing a great and complex wisdom, all the while feeling as though he were drowning in the quiet, absolute madness of it all. The weight of Abner's revelations settled over Elias like a second, heavier fog, one that clouded not the air but his very perception of the island and its people. The horror he had so carefully concealed in the patriarch's presence now churned within him, a cold, sickening dread. It was Caleb who found him later, standing at the edge of the cliff path, staring blindly at the churning gray sea as if it were the only sane thing left in the world. Caleb's approach was quiet, his rolling gait a soft crunch on the gravel. He did not speak for a long time, simply standing beside Elias, his own gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for the same answers. "The first ones came here seeking refuge," Caleb began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble unprompted. It was not the fervent declaration of Abner, but the weary tone of a man recounting a history he had inherited, not chosen. Persecuted for their beliefs, they found this rock and saw not isolation, but a fortress. A place to build a new Eden, unsullied by the world. He spoke of the initial generations, of the hard, proud people who carved a life from the stubborn soil and treacherous waters. But as the decades turned, the world outside receded into myth, and the fortress walls became a cage. The doctrine of purity, he explained, began as a simple preference for their own kind, a way to preserve their unique identity. But over time, under the leadership of zealous patriarchs, it was twisted. Passages from their single, heavily annotated Bible were isolated and reinterpreted, woven into a new scripture that sanctified their seclusion and glorified their bloodline. What began as practical necessity was sanctified into divine mandate. The choice to remain apart became a commandment, and the resulting physical traits became holy stigmata. Caleb's confession was a key turning a lock in Elias's mind. The eerie silence, the physical quirks, the reverent whispers. It all clicked into a devastating, coherent picture. This was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate, generations-long descent into a faith that fed upon its own decay. Later that evening, Caleb led him to a gathering in the longhouse. The air was thick with the smoke of burning peat and the press of bodies. At the center of the room, a man named Silas was rocking back and forth, his eyes wide and unseeing, a string of incoherent, guttural sounds falling from his lips. Spittle flecked his beard. To Elias, it was a stark, pitiable portrait of a fractured mind. But the clan did not look away in pity or fear. They watched with rapt attention, their faces lit with a fervent, terrifying awe. An elder stood and declared that Silas was in the throes of a divine rapture, that God's voice was too powerful for a mortal mouth to form into words. They saw not madness, but prophecy. They saw not a broken man, but a blessed vessel. Elias watched as men and women reached out to touch Silas's trembling hands, as if seeking to draw some of that holy affliction into themselves. The reverence was absolute, a collective agreement to call darkness light. In that moment, the full, devastating effect of the doctrine revealed itself to him. It was a self-perpetuating engine of delusion, where the very evidence of its harm, the mental instability, the physical toll of inbreeding, was worshipped as proof of its virtue. It was a faith that had turned its back on reason so completely that it now embraced its own destruction as a form of grace. The resolve that had been a faint spark within Elias now hardened into a cold, clear purpose. He could not simply wait for rescue or recovery. He had to understand the full, terrible depth of this place, to uncover the roots of this poisonous tree, not just for his own survival, but as a witness to the profound tragedy unfolding in the mist-shrouded silence of Haven's End. The first sign was a low, guttural moan that cut through the evening's quiet like a physical tear in the fabric of the world. It came from the longhouse, a sound of such raw, unadulterated anguish that it froze Elias where he stood, a half-eaten piece of hard bread forgotten in his hand. The clan, who had been moving about their evening chores with their usual somber rhythm, immediately stilled. But it was not alarm that painted their faces. It was a sudden, electric anticipation. They began to move as one, not away from the sound, but toward it, their steps quickening with a fervor Elias had not yet witnessed. Drawn by a morbid and dreadful curiosity, he allowed himself to be swept along in their current. Inside the longhouse, the scene was one of controlled chaos. An elder named Josiah, a man Elias had only ever seen sitting silently in a corner, was the epicenter of the storm. He was a gaunt figure, all sharp angles and parchment skin, but now he was transformed. He thrashed against the firm but not unkind hands of Caleb and another man, his limbs moving with a jerky, violent energy that seemed to defy his frail body. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated into black pools that saw nothing of the room around him. A string of guttural, nonsensical syllables ripped from his throat, a language of pure, unfiltered torment. Flecks of foam gathered at the corners of his lips, and the veins in his temples stood out like dark cords. To Elias, it was a harrowing spectacle of a mind in its death throes, a private hell made terrifyingly public. He braced for cries of alarm, for attempts to soothe or restrain the old man. Instead, a wave of exultant cheering erupted from the gathered clan. They did not shrink back. They pressed closer, their faces alight with a zealous joy that was more frightening than Josiah's madness. "He speaks!" a woman cried out, her voice trembling with ecstasy. "The Lord is upon him," another shouted. They raised their hands, not in defense, but in supplication, as if bathing in the raw, chaotic energy pouring from the old man. They saw his violent convulsions not as seizures, but as sacred tremors. They heard his incoherent ravings not as the babble of a broken mind, but as the direct, unmediated voice of God. As the episode subsided, leaving Josiah limp and weeping softly in Caleb's arms, the clan's mood did not dim. It settled into a deep, reverent hum. An elder moved to the center of the room and began to preach, his voice swelling with conviction. He explained that these episodes of madness were the highest form of spiritual awakening, a state where the individual soul was so pure it became a hollow reed for the divine wind to blow through. The violence, the incoherence, the physical distress. All of it was proof that the mortal vessel was struggling to contain the immense power of God's presence. To suffer such an episode was not a curse. It was the clan's greatest blessing, a sign that one had achieved a state of grace so profound it shattered the confines of ordinary consciousness. The truth of it crashed over Elias with the force of a tidal wave. This was the logical, horrifying endpoint of the doctrine of purity. It was a faith that had not only made a virtue of physical suffering but had canonized mental collapse. It worshipped the breaking point itself. The dread that had been a cold stone in his gut now bloomed into a full, chilling panic. He had to speak to someone, anyone who might see a sliver of the sanity he was clinging to. His eyes found Miriam, standing slightly apart from the main group, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was not lit with the same fervent joy as the others. It was pale, her two wide eyes holding a deep, troubled shadow. He found his chance later, as the clan dispersed, their spirits still high from the divine spectacle. He intercepted her on the path back to the huts, the mist coiling around their ankles like serpents. "What I saw in there," he began, his voice low and urgent. "That was not God. That was a sick, tormented man." Miriam did not look at him at first, her gaze fixed on the ground. A long, tense silence stretched between them, filled only by the drip of moisture from the eaves. When she finally spoke, her voice was a bare whisper, taut with a fear she could barely contain. "I know," she admitted, the two words a seismic confession in the quiet night. "I have always known. Since I was a girl, I have seen these awakenings. I have seen the light die in their eyes long before their bodies give out." She risked a glance at him, and in that fleeting look, he saw the full weight of her trapped existence. A woman bound by loyalty to her family, her people, and the only world she had ever known, yet seeing its foundations as rotten timber. But to speak against it is to speak against God himself here. It is to be cast out, or worse. My family, my children. Their place is here. Her admission was not a plea for help, but a statement of tragic fact. It was the sound of a chain being tested and found unbreakable. In her conflicted heart, Elias saw the central, agonizing conflict of Haven's end made flesh. A faith that demanded the surrender of reason, and a loyalty that demanded the silencing of fear. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky choked with cloud, offering little light but enough shadow for a desperate man to become a ghost. Elias moved through the sleeping village with a thief's caution, each footfall a deliberate, silent press into the damp earth. The memory of Josiah's sacred madness and Miriam's trapped confession pulsed through him, a drumbeat of urgency that overrode the ache of his healing body. He had to know more. The whispered warnings and doctrinal horrors pointed toward a center, a source from which this poisoned faith flowed. His destination was a place Caleb had once mentioned offhand, a fissure in the northern cliffs said to be unstable and forbidden, the Whispering Cave. The entrance was a dark, narrow gash in the rock face, half hidden by a curtain of thorny brambles that clawed at his clothes as he pushed through. The air that exhaled from the opening was cold and carried the scent of wet stone and profound age. Using a makeshift torch of bundled rags soaked in fish oil, its flame guttering and spitting, he descended into the belly of the island. The passage was tight, forcing him to turn sideways at points, the rough walls scraping against his shoulders. The silence here was different from the village. It was the deep, absorbing quiet of a tomb. The tunnel opened abruptly into a chamber that stole his breath. It was not large, but its walls were a tapestry of painted symbols. Crude, ochre-red spirals, handprints, and stark, angular figures that seemed to dance in the flickering torchlight. At the center of the chamber, resting on a natural stone plinth as if placed upon an altar, was a book. It was bound in a leather that was dark and cracked with age. The hide stretched taut over warped wooden boards. It looked less like an object and more like a piece of the earth itself, something that had grown there in the dark. His hands trembled as he reached for it, a superstitious fear prickling his skin. The cover was cold and rough against his fingertips. He opened it carefully, the spine cracking in protest, releasing a cloud of dust that smelled of mildew and forgotten centuries. The pages within were vellum, yellowed and brittle, the script a dense, spidery hand in faded iron gall ink. It was a chronicle of Haven's End, but not the sanitized version Abner preached. This was the raw, unfiltered Genesis. He read of the first settlers, their fervent belief that they were building a new Jerusalem. He read of the early debates, the fears of bloodsickness, and the gradual, insidious shift in interpretation where selected verses from Leviticus and Deuteronomy were twisted into a mandate for isolation and purity. His heart hammered against his ribs as he turned the pages, the torch flickering as if in sympathy with his rising panic. Then he found it, near the end of the book, a section set apart with elaborate, almost frantic illuminations of a full moon and a stylized, bleeding heart. The heading read, "The Prophecy of the Unblemished Sacrifice." His eyes raced over the text, his breath catching in his throat. It spoke of a time of waning purity, when the bloodline would grow stagnant and the signs of God would weaken. In that time of crisis, a storm would deliver an outsider, a man untainted by the fold, whose blood was not of their closed circle. This outsider, the text declared, was destined to complete the final rite, a sacred ceremony under the full moon where his unblemished blood would be offered to renew the covenant and reinvigorate the pure line. The words blurred before his eyes. A storm, an outsider, the final rite. It was all there, written in this ancient, cursed book. He was not a castaway. He was a prophesied component, a key delivered by the sea itself. He frantically turned the page, his fingers leaving damp prints on the vellum. The next section detailed the ritual itself. It described the construction of a stone altar, the chanting of specific psalms, the use of a ceremonial blade, an obsidian knife depicted in a chillingly detailed sketch. The purpose was stated with a cold liturgical finality. The sacrificial offering of the outsider's lifeblood, which, when spilled upon the sacred ground, would act as a potent catalyst, washing away the stagnation of generations and restoring the clan's divine favor. A cold, sharp terror, more paralyzing than any wave, seized him. It was not a metaphor. It was not a spiritual allegory. It was a blueprint for murder sanctified by time and twisted faith. The panic was a live thing in his chest, scrambling his thoughts, turning his blood to ice. The faint, damp air of the cave suddenly felt suffocating, the painted figures on the walls seeming to leer at him. He was the unblemished sacrifice. His arrival had not been an accident. It had been the fulfillment of their darkest scripture. He was not a guest in this village of the damned. He was their chosen lamb, waiting for the moon to wax full. The sacred text felt like a brand against his soul, its grim prophecy searing itself into his mind with the permanence of a tomb carving. For 2 days, Elias moved through the routines of the clan like a man already dead. His smile strained, his movements wooden. Every glance felt like a measurement, every whisper a confirmation of his doomed role. He saw the clan not as a community of misguided souls, but as a single, patient organism waiting to perform a sacred dissection. The full moon was a little over a week away, a celestial clock ticking down in the ever-clearing night sky, its growing light a mockery of the darkness gathering within him. The confrontation came not in the secrecy of the cave or the shadows of the forest, but in the stark, open light of day. Patriarch Abner found him near the communal fire pit, where Elias was pretending to mend a net with fumbling, unskilled hands. Abner did not approach with stealth or ceremony. He simply emerged from between two huts, the ancient, leather-bound book held before him in both hands like a holy relic. The clan, who had been moving about their morning tasks, slowed and then stilled, forming a loose, silent circle around them. The air grew thick with a palpable, eager tension. Abner stopped a few feet from Elias, his deep-set eyes burning with a terrifying certainty. He did not open the book. He merely held it up, its cracked cover facing Elias like an accusation. "The storm did not cast you upon our shore by chance, fisherman." Abner's voice rang out, clear and resonant, meant for all to hear. It was a delivery, a divine hand guiding you to your destiny. He lowered the book, his gaze pinning Elias in place. "The scriptures have foretold your coming for generations. A man from the outside, unblemished by our fold, whose arrival would herald the renewal of our covenant." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He forced his voice to remain level, a desperate attempt to appeal to a reason he knew did not exist here. "Patriarch Abner," he began, his words careful, measured. "I am just a fisherman. My boat was lost in the storm. There is no destiny in that, only bad weather and misfortune. I have no place in your rituals." A faint, chilling smile touched Abner's thin lips. "You see with the eyes of the world, Elias. You see coincidence where there is providence. Your presence here is not misfortune. It is the culmination of our faith. It is God's will." His tone brooked no argument. It was the flat, final sound of absolute belief. "At the full moon you will take your place at the heart of the final rite. Your pure blood, offered upon the altar, will cleanse our line and restore the vigor of our bond with the divine. It is not a choice. It is your purpose, written in the stars and in this sacred text long before you were born." As Abner spoke, a wave of excitement rippled through the gathered clan. Murmurs of "praise be," and "the prophecy is fulfilled" rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. Their faces, once merely curious or stoic, were now alight with a zealous, hungry joy. They looked at him not as a man, but as a symbol, a vital component in their salvation. He was no longer Elias the castaway. He was the unblemished sacrifice, and their fervor was a cage being built around him, bar by invisible bar. His eyes, desperate for any sign of sanity, any flicker of dissent, scanned the ring of faces. They moved over Caleb's stolid acceptance, over Miriam's carefully averted gaze, over the eager, unblinking stares of the others. And then he found her. Leah was standing slightly behind her mother, partially obscured. Her small hands were clenched at her sides, and her gaze was fixed on him. But unlike the others, her expression held no joy, no religious fervor. In her wide, clear eyes, he saw a profound and unmistakable sorrow. It was a look of pity, of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the horrific truth he now faced. That single, sympathetic glance was a lifeline thrown across a chasm of madness, a tiny, fragile confirmation that not every heart on Haven's End had been completely consumed by the darkness. But it was a lifeline he had no way of grasping, and as the clan's excited murmurs swelled around him, he felt the walls of his trap close in, solid and inescapable as stone. The island itself seemed to quicken its pulse in the days that followed Abner's proclamation. The heavy, waiting silence that had characterized Elias's first weeks on Haven's End was shattered, replaced by a hive of purposeful, unnerving activity. The air, once thick with mist and quiet dread, now hummed with the sounds of industry, each strike of a hammer and scrape of a chisel a direct, physical countdown to the full moon. Elias watched it all from the periphery of his existence, a prisoner granted the cruel courtesy of witnessing the construction of his own execution platform. The chosen site was a flat, circular clearing at the highest point of the island, a place where the wind whipped uninterrupted from the sea, carrying away the last vestiges of warmth. Here, the clan's men, under Caleb's direction, began to raise the altar. It was not a simple table of wood, but a brutal, permanent structure of heavy, sea-smooth stones hauled up from the shore. They fit them together with a grim, practiced efficiency, the gray rocks locking into place to form a wide, waist-high dais that dominated the center of the clearing. Its surface was deliberately flat and unadorned, a stark, functional slab that left no room for doubt about its purpose. Watching them work, Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not a place for prayer. It was a place for an offering. Around the base of the nascent altar, the women and older children worked with a different, more esoteric focus. They knelt on the hard ground, using sharpened flints and iron nails to carve a complex web of symbols into the earth. The patterns were angular and alien, a stark contrast to the soft, organic shapes of the natural world. He saw spirals that ended in sharp hooks, interlocking circles that looked like chain links, and jagged lines that radiated outwards like frozen lightning. They were the same symbols he had seen painted in ochre on the walls of the Whispering Cave, pulled from the ancient text and translated onto the living skin of the island. The clan worked with a reverent intensity, their faces set in expressions of solemn concentration, as if each mark they etched was a word in a prayer that would summon their god. To Elias, they were the runes of his own death sentence, a dark magic made manifest in soil and stone. It was during the third day of preparations, as he stood pretending to examine the fishing nets they still occasionally had him mend, that a folded, greasy piece of parchment found its way into his hand. Miriam brushed past him, her movement so swift and seamless it was over before he had registered her presence. The contact was fleeting, but the small square of parchment was now a burning secret in his palm. He waited until he was back in the solitude of his hut, the sounds of construction a distant, ominous percussion, before he unfolded it. The writing was cramped and hurried, scratched onto the parchment with what looked like a piece of charcoal. It was not the prophecy from the sacred text, but something far older, a fragment of a different story Miriam had clearly risked everything to copy. It spoke of the first rite, performed not by the original settlers, but by their children, a generation born into the isolation. It described a season of blight and sickness, when the fish vanished from the waters and the crops withered in the ground. In their desperation, the second patriarch, a man named Malachi, had claimed a vision. The land was hungry. It demanded a sacrifice, not of a lamb or a harvest offering, but of a life untainted by the island's blood, a life that represented the world they had forsaken. A young outsider, a shipwrecked sailor from a passing vessel, had been their first unblemished. The parchment ended there. But the implication was a blade twisting in Elias's gut. The ritual's origins were not divine. They were born of famine and fear, a desperate act of a dying people that had, through repetition and twisted scripture, been sanctified into tradition. His fate was not a blessed destiny. It was the perpetuation of an ancient, bloody superstition. The fear that had been a cold dread within him now ignited into a raw, primal terror. He was not a key to their salvation. He was a relic of their deepest, most desperate sin. The truth of the ritual's origins, passed to him on that greasy scrap of parchment, festered in Elias's mind like a poison. It stripped the ceremony of its last vestige of sacred mystery, revealing it for what it was: a brutal, archaic superstition, a ghost of desperation that had hardened over generations into a killing faith. This knowledge did not lessen his fear, but refined it, sharpening it into a cold, clear-edged resolve. He could no longer afford the luxury of passive dread. He had to know the precise mechanics of his own death. His opportunity came under the cover of a blustery, rain-swept twilight. The clan had gathered in the longhouse for their evening meal and devotions, their unified chanting a low drone that competed with the wind. Slipping from his hut, Elias became a shadow flitting between the larger shadows of the village, his path taking him not toward the ceremonial clearing, but toward the back of the longhouse itself. A single, small window, its hide covering poorly stretched, was his target. Pressing himself against the cold, damp wood of the wall. He held his breath and listened. The voices inside were not the unified chant of the congregation, but the lower, more deliberate tones of Abner, Caleb, and a few of the other elders, gathered in a separate alcove away from the main group. Their words, though muffled by the wall and the storm, carried with a chilling clarity. The obsidian must be honed to a perfect edge, Abner's voice intoned, a sound like stone grinding on stone. A single, clean cut is essential. The purity of the offering depends on the swiftness of the release. A colder, sharper fear, different from the generalized terror he had felt before, lanced through Elias. They were discussing the blade. The ceremonial knife from the cave drawing was not a symbol. It was a real, physical tool being prepared to open his veins. And the incantation? Caleb's voice, gruff and practical. The one from the 3rd chapter of the Rite of Renewal. Precisely, Abner confirmed. The words must be spoken as the blood first touches the stone. The ancient tongue holds the power to bind the offering to our line, to channel its revitalizing force. There can be no error. The moon's light will be our witness, and the words will be our covenant. Elias's blood ran cold. It was not just a killing. It was a blood ceremony, a precise and ritualized act of murder where his final moments would be soundtracked by pagan chants, his lifeblood measured for its efficacy in their twisted alchemy of faith. He was not merely a sacrifice, he was an ingredient. He risked a glance through a gap in the hide covering. He saw them gathered around a small table. Caleb was carefully unwrapping a long, dark object from a piece of oilcloth. Even in the dim light, the obsidian knife gleamed, a shard of captured night, its edges seeming to drink the faint luminescence from the room. Another elder was unrolling a scroll, its surface covered in the same spidery script as the cave book, pointing to a specific passage. The planning was meticulous, clinical. They were not frenzied fanatics, but calm, devoted practitioners preparing for the most important sacrament of their lives. Pulling back from the window, Elias felt the world tilt. The fervor of the clan, which had been a distant, ominous hum, now felt like a physical pressure, a wall closing in. He could see it in their eyes during the day, a feverish brightness that had replaced their usual stoic reverence. They watched him with a new, proprietary intensity, their gazes lingering on his wrists, his throat, as if already seeing the life that would flow from them. The sense of being trapped was no longer a psychological state but a physical reality, as tangible as the stone altar on the cliff. Escape was no longer a possibility to be considered. It was an absolute, desperate necessity. But he was one man on an island of believers, surrounded by water and watched by zealous eyes. His gaze swept the dark, rain-lashed village, searching for any flicker of opposition, any crack in the monolithic faith. He needed an ally. He needed a miracle. And in the memory of a single sorrowful glance from a young girl's eyes, he thought he might have found the beginnings of one. The weight of his fate was a stone in his chest, but it was the memory of Leah's sorrowful glance that gave it a sharp, specific edge. In a village where every other gaze held either zealous fervor or dull acceptance, her brief moment of shared understanding was a beacon in the encroaching dark. He had to risk it. The alternative was to wait passively for the full moon to rise and the obsidian blade to fall. He found his chance one afternoon, when the clan's attention was wholly consumed by the final, feverish preparations at the ceremonial clearing. The rhythmic clang of hammer on chisel and the low drone of chanted psalms provided a cover of noise. He saw Leah sent to fetch a basket of kindling from a woodpile near the tree line, a solitary, mundane task in the midst of the sacred frenzy. He moved with a casualness he did not feel, intercepting her as she bent to gather the split wood. The air between them was taut, charged with the unspoken truth of his predicament. He did not waste words on pleasantries or gradual persuasion. Time was a luxury he no longer possessed. "They mean to kill me at the full moon," he whispered, the words stark and simple in the damp air. "You know it, don't you?" Leah froze, her hands still clutching a piece of firewood. She did not look at him, but her shoulders tensed, a tiny, telltale flinch that was more eloquent than any denial. A long, silent moment stretched between them, filled only by the distant, ominous sounds from the cliff. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes met his, and the sorrow he had seen before was now mingled with a fierce, defiant clarity. "I have always doubted," she confessed, her voice so low it was almost swallowed by the rustle of the pines. "The madness they call God's voice, the pain they call a blessing. I see the weakness in our blood, not its strength. I see the fear in my mother's eyes, not her faith. Her admission was a dam breaking, a quiet torrent of long-suppressed truth. I will not watch them spill your blood for a lie born of hunger and fear." With those words, a fragile alliance was forged in the shadow of the altar. The plan was born in hurried, hushed exchanges over the next 2 days, snatched in moments when they could feign mundane chores near the forest's edge. Leah's knowledge of the island, its hidden paths and forgotten corners, was their only currency. She told him of a small, deep-cut cove on the western shore, a place the clan avoided, believing it to be cursed by the spirits of the first outsiders who had been sacrificed there generations ago. It was there, she revealed, that the clan had dragged the wreckage of his fishing boat, the shattered timbers of the Sea Wife pulled into the shallows and mostly forgotten, a relic to be disposed of after the more pressing matter of the ritual was complete. Their plan was a thread of hope, thin and perilous. They would use the cover of the ritual night itself, when every soul on Haven's End would be gathered at the clifftop clearing, their attention fixed on the ceremony. In the chaos of the chanting and the firelight, they would slip away. Under the cloak of darkness, they would navigate the treacherous, overgrown path to the cursed cove. There, amidst the ghost-ridden wreckage, they would attempt the impossible, to repair enough of the shattered hull to make it seaworthy, to trust his damaged vessel and the mercy of the open ocean more than they trusted the clan and its sacred knife. The tension became a physical presence, a third party to their every move. Gathering supplies was an exercise in nerve and stealth. Leah smuggled a hammer, a handful of rusty nails, and a small, tar-coated canvas patch from the communal toolshed, hiding them beneath a loose floorboard in his hut. Elias, under the guise of seeking solitude for prayer, scavenged for materials along the shore, pocketing strands of tough, fibrous seaweed that could be used for lashing and collecting scraps of driftwood that might serve as makeshift braces. Every footstep behind him felt like an accusation, every curious glance a prelude to discovery. The island itself seemed to watch them, its misty breath a veil that could part at any moment to reveal their treachery. They moved like ghosts through the waking nightmare of the village, their hearts pounding a frantic, syncopated rhythm against the steady, inexorable drumbeat of the approaching ritual. The plan was a desperate gamble, a race against the moon and the madness of Haven's End, and the price of failure was written in the ancient, blood-stained pages of the sacred text. The full moon rose over Haven's End like a great, baleful eye, its cold, silver light bleaching the color from the world and casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl with a life of their own. It was a light that did not illuminate but exposed, stripping away the last vestiges of the island's daytime ambiguity and revealing the stark, terrifying truth of the night. From his hut, Elias watched its ascent, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The air, once heavy with salt and mist, was now thick with the scent of smoke and the electric tang of fanaticism. The rhythmic, guttural chanting had begun at dusk, a low, unified drone that emanated from the clifftop clearing and seeped into the very soil of the island, a vocal tide rising to meet the celestial one. He could see the orange glow of the ritual fires painting the undersides of the low-hanging clouds, a false, hellish dawn. The time for waiting was over. Slipping from the hut, he became a part of the flowing darkness, his movements guided by the frantic plan he and Leah had pieced together. The village was deserted, every soul drawn to the magnetic pull of the ceremony. He moved toward the prearranged meeting point at the edge of the tree line, where the shadows were deepest and the chanting was a muffled roar. Leah was there, a small, tense silhouette against the pulsating firelight from the cliff. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she gave a sharp, determined nod. This was their moment. The chaos of the ritual was the only cloak they would get. They turned their backs on the fiery glow and plunged into the deeper darkness of the forest path that led toward the western shore. For a few breathless moments, it seemed their desperate gamble might work. The roar of the clan faded behind them, replaced by the crunch of their own footsteps on the needle-strewn path and the ragged sound of their breathing. The blessed silence of the trees felt like a reprieve, the cold night air a balm. But the reprieve was fleeting. A heavy figure detached itself from the shadows ahead, blocking their path with a solid, unmoving presence. It was Caleb. His face, lit by the slivers of moonlight piercing the canopy, was not angry, but profoundly disappointed, the look of a shepherd finding a lost lamb trying to flee the fold. There was no time for words, for pleas or explanations. Caleb's hand shot out, a meaty paw closing around Elias's arm with a grip like iron. The contact was a spark to tinder. The fear and desperation that had been coiling within Elias for weeks erupted in a single violent surge. He did not think, he fought. He threw his weight backward, twisting against the unyielding grip, his free hand clawing at Caleb's face. It was a wild, inelegant struggle, a thrashing of limbs in the confined space of the path. Caleb grunted, surprised by the ferocity of the resistance, his other hand coming up to clamp around Elias's throat, cutting off his air. The world began to swim in a haze of spotted darkness, the chanting from the cliff seeming to grow louder, as if the island itself were cheering for his submission. It was Leah who broke the deadly stalemate. With a cry that was part terror and part fury, she launched herself not at Caleb, but at a nearby deadfall, a tangle of dry, brittle branches. She seized the largest limb she could handle and, with all her strength, swung it in a wide, shattering arc against the trunk of a large pine. The crack was explosive, a gunshot in the quiet forest. The sound echoed through the trees, stark and alien against the rhythmic chanting. For a split second, Caleb's attention wavered, his head turning instinctively toward the source of the sudden noise. His grip on Elias's throat loosened by a fraction. It was all the opening Elias needed. He drove his knee upward with every ounce of his remaining strength. Caleb buckled with a choked grunt, his grasp breaking completely. Elias did not wait. Shoving the stumbling man aside, he lunged past him, his lungs burning as he gulped in the cold air. He did not look back for Leah. Her distraction had been her gift, her sacrifice. He heard Caleb's roar of rage and the sounds of a new struggle behind him, but he forced himself to run, his legs pumping, his breath sobbing in his chest. He crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring for stealth, driven only by the primal imperative of flight. Behind him, the unified chanting fractured into shouts of confusion and alarm. The ritual's sacred focus had been broken. The perfect, fervent unity of the clan shattered into chaos, and into that chaos, Elias fled, a single, desperate figure racing through the moon-striped darkness toward the whisper of the sea and the ghost of a chance. The sea was a black, heaving monster, its cold embrace a shocking reprieve from the fiery madness of the island. Elias clung to the makeshift raft, his fingers numb and raw where they gripped the lashed-together logs. Each surge of the waves was a fresh agony, a brutal reminder of the storm that had first delivered him to that cursed shore. But now the ocean was his savior, carrying him away from the hell of Haven's End. He did not look back. The orange glow of the ritual fires was a diminishing stain on the horizon, the raised voices of the clan now lost to the wind and the crash of water. He was free, but the freedom was a hollow, aching thing, purchased with a debt of horror that would never be repaid. As the raft rose and fell on the swells, the events of the night replayed behind his eyes with a brutal, crystalline clarity. The chilling certainty in Abner's voice as he preached the doctrine of purity. The terrifying joy on the faces of the clan as they celebrated Josiah's sacred madness. The feel of the ancient, cursed vellum in the whispering cave, its prophecy sealing his fate. And Leah, her intelligent eyes, her whispered doubts, the final, desperate crack of the branch that had given him this chance. He saw her in his mind, a small, brave figure creating a distraction, holding back the tide of fanaticism for a few precious seconds so he could flee. Was she safe? Had her rebellion been met with punishment or understanding? The not knowing was a fresh wound, a ghost that would forever haunt the edges of his memory. He had escaped with his life, but he had left a piece of his soul in the mist, with a girl who had seen the truth in a world of lies. Dawn broke, a thin, gray line separating the turbulent sea from the bruised sky. The light revealed the vast, empty expanse of water and the utter fragility of his vessel. It also revealed the mainland, a dark, solid smudge in the distance. Hope, a feeling he had thought extinguished, flickered weakly in his chest. He paddled with his hands, his muscles screaming in protest, his body pushed beyond its limits. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and exposure, a trial by water that stripped him down to his most primal self. When the raft finally scraped against the pebbled shore of a deserted cove, he collapsed, his face pressed into the cold, wet stones, weeping with a relief so profound it felt like a new kind of pain. Weeks later, sitting in a sparse room in a quiet coastal town, the physical scars of his ordeal had begun to fade. The sunburn peeled away, the cuts and bruises healed. But the other scars, the ones etched into his mind and spirit, remained raw and vivid. The world outside his window, the sound of children playing, the smell of bread baking, the simple, unremarkable normality of it all, felt alien and fragile. He tried to speak of it once, to a grizzled old fisherman who shared his tobacco and his silence. The words caught in his throat, clumsy and inadequate. How could he describe the celebratory madness, the worship of deformity, the cold, liturgical planning of his own murder? The story sounded like the ravings of a madman, a fever dream born of salt and solitude. He saw the polite disbelief in the old man's eyes and let the story die. He vowed, in the quiet of his own heart, to find a way to warn others, to chart the treacherous waters, to ensure no other soul was delivered to that altar. But he knew, with a sickening certainty, that Haven's end would remain, a fortress of fog and faith, isolated by choice and by the sea, its dark rituals continuing under the full moon, a secret festering just beyond the edge of the map. And on the island, in the long shadowed days that followed the failed ritual, a new kind of silence fell. It was not the quiet of devotion, but the strained hush of a cracked foundation. Patriarch Abner's authority, once absolute, now bore the hairline fracture of the outsider's escape. Whispers, different from before, now threaded through the mist. They were not about purity or blessings, but about a young girl who had dared to question, to act. Leah, once a quiet observer, now moved through the village with her mother, her head held high. She said nothing, offered no defense or confession. But in her eyes, for those who cared to look, the spark of perception had become a steady, smoldering flame. The clan's fate hung in the balance, suspended between the crushing weight of its ancient traditions and the fragile, defiant ember of a single, rebellious heart. The island held its breath, waiting to see which would prevail.